The wood we use on projects often has a story to tell. From the fresh cut logs to the sawmills across America, its journey as rough sawn boards doesn't last long as it makes its way home to your shop, and then straight to your planer sled to get it milled for your next piece of furniture. Oh wait, you don't have a planer sled? Don't worry, on this episode of Shopfix, I'll teach you how to build this custom planer sled for face joining. If you're new to the Shopfix channel, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's get right to this. First, you'll want to mill up a few 2x4s as they'll make up the inside pieces to this planer sled. I'll simply face joint one side square and send the other side through the planer. I ended up with roughly 2 boards at 24 inches, 3 boards at 20 inches, and 1 board at 18 inches. For the final crosscuts, I needed 7 boards at 8 inches and 2 boards at 24 inches. I used a stop block to ensure that I cut them all uniformly. Lastly, I cut the 2 24-inch boards in half to make up the 4-foot sides of the planer sled. This planer sled is essentially a grid of pine 2x4s sandwiched between 2 flat pieces of 1/2 inch MDF, so let's rip those MDF pieces next. These MDF pieces will be 11 inches wide and 4 feet long. The width of your planer sled should be customized to fit the width of your planer. Well, now it's time to test fit the placement of the pine pieces that make up the inside of this planer sled. Next, we will trace out the location of the boards so we'll know where to apply the glue. After applying a generous amount of wood glue, we'll go ahead and set each board in its proper location. Then we can simply coat the top of the pine boards with a layer of glue, and then set the other MDF panel on top, finishing by securing all the boards with clamps. If you've enjoyed this Shopfix video so far, click that like button. Thanks for your support. After the sled was dry, I ripped both of the sides to reveal a nice smooth finish. I evened up the ends as well at the miter saw. Now we have the basic structure of the planer sled complete. The total thickness of the planer sled is 2 1/4 inch, which includes the 2 pieces of 1/2 inch MDF and the 1 1/4 inch pine boards in between. Next, we'll need to drill a series of holes where the pine boards are located within the MDF panels. The first hole drilled will be 1 3/8 inch and will house a 1 1/4 inch dowel. This particular hole was cut to a 7/8 inch depth. A 3/4 shallow recess will be created next for the placement of a 3-prong nut inside the hole. I decided to drill 3 evenly spaced holes in each of the 7 pine boards for a total of 21 holes. Finally, a hole will need to be drilled all the way through the sled as to mount a bolt from the bottom of the sled and all the way through the 3-prong nut. To allow the bolt to move the dowel rod up and down freely, we will drill a recess 5/8 inch up from the bottom, which will be wider than the diameter of the head of the bolt. Now that we have all the necessary holes drilled into the sled, we will cut out the 1 1/4 inch dowel to fit inside the sled. We'll cut this oak dowel into 21 pieces, roughly 3/4 in length. These pieces will be used to wedge any gaps when milling lumber. To enable the bolts to securely raise and lower the dowel wedges, we'll need to drill a hole about 3/8 inch deep into each wedge. I use this 3/4 MDF to create a stop at the end of the sled. I cut it so it would rest a 1/2 inch above the surface of the sled. I would recommend mounting a stop at both ends of the sled as the board has a tendency to move forwards as well. I myself recently added an additional stop at the front of the sled. With the sled all assembled together with the proper holes drilled, we can go ahead and apply some finish. I happen to use boiled linseed oil. Once the finish dries, it's time to mount the 3-prong nuts inside of the holes. I use one of the bolts to reference the hole as I tapped it into place. Once lined up, I remove the bolt and finish by hammering with this dowel. This is what the holes will look like after screwing the bolts on. However, before we do, we need to add a compression spring to each bolt. These compression springs are very important because they provide friction onto the nut so that the vibrations of the planer do not rattle the bolts out of place as you plane lumber. At this step, I simply screwed the bolt and the springs into place until they all rested inside the sled. Now it's just a matter of placing all the dowel wedges on top of the bolts. My custom planer sled was finished and ready for its first test run. I decided to use this piece of rough sawn cherry to test out the planer sled as it was extremely warped. After placing the board on top of the planer sled, I needed to clamp the board at the edges where the board laid flat on the surface of the sled. Here's a picture showing you the unevenness of this cherry board. To wedge those gaps so they do not flatten during planing, we will simply raise the dowel wedges by tightening the bolts from underneath the sled until the wedge rests firmly underneath the wood. Afterwards, we can remove the clamps and send our sled through the planer, making sure to set our planer at the highest point of the top board. As we lower the cutter head and make another pass, we'll begin to shave off the highest points of the board. You can see here that the planer has begun to flatten the board by shaving the highest points down. With a few more passes, we have one side completely flat, so we'll be able to flip this board over and take it off the planer sled. This custom planer sled is highly accurate because of the amount of wedges holding up the boards at various points, and it produces a nice finish, especially on this cherry lumber. Well, I hope that you found this video enjoyable, and I wish you the best of luck with your planer sled if you plan on crafting one.